Good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar on managing GHG emissions from target setting to net zero. I'm Shiv Kumar Sharma, Sustainability Marketing Manager at Olive Gaea, and it's an honor to have you join us as we delve into the crucial topic of greenhouse gas emissions management and the journey towards net zero. This webinar is part of our ongoing series to provide businesses with insights, tools, and strategies for sustainable growth and compliance. We have an exciting lineup of topics in coming months, so stay tuned for more sessions that will equip you with the knowledge to drive your sustainability initiatives forward. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Jessica to guide us through the fascinating world of GHG management. Jessica, over to you.
Thank you, Shiv. Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. Very briefly, for those of you who don't know us yet, a quick intro. Olive Gaea is a Dubai-based climate tech. Over the past couple of years, we have been supporting organizations assess and manage their greenhouse gas emissions in the UAE and the broader GCC and India region. We have a very clear mission here, which is to help close the climate action gap. And we do this in a number of different ways, starting with our automated AI-driven carbon accounting, decarbonization, and ESG reporting SaaS platform, which is called Zero, as well as via bespoke consulting services and API services, which enable organizations to engage with their customers by offering carbon neutral services or products. Now, on to the focus of today's webinar, net zero. So let's define, first of all, what it is and what it is not. A simple way, to do this is to look at the difference between net zero and carbon neutral. So in very simple terms, both net zero and carbon neutral mean balancing out the greenhouse gases that a company or an organization releases in the atmosphere. But to be carbon neutral, a company usually measures its emissions, and then generally speaking, it pays for offsetting projects without necessarily cutting its own emissions. Net zero, on the other hand, requires companies to, first of all, seriously cut emissions through their entire operations. As per the SBTi, the Science-Based Targets Initiative that we will explore later in the webinar, companies explore or must actually first reduce or at least 90% their emissions, and then they can eventually compensate the remaining 10% or less through offsets. Now, it is pretty clear that net zero requires quite an effort from any organization, as it mandates not only a thorough analysis, but also radical change in business practices and value chain management in order to be able to cut emissions so much. So why should companies do that? Well, beyond the moral imperative, of course, which includes mitigating the worst effects of climate change and protecting our own environment, luckily there is also a strong business case for decarbonization. First of all, it helps in risk mitigation. Climate change is causing more frequent and severe weather events, which disrupt supply chains and operations. So decarbonizing can really make organizations more resilient to these climate risks. But also, as the world shifts toward a low carbon economy, companies that fail to decarbonize may face challenges with outdated technologies, stranded assets, or even loss of competitiveness. So again, decarbonization can really address these transitional risks. Decarbonization and net zero can also have a very meaningful impact on the cost of capital and a company's ability to attract investors. So despite the current headwinds that, as we know, ESG ratings are currently facing, we know from research and studies that 85% of institutional investors do actually still consider ESG factors in their investment decisions. But of course, corporate sustainability, and as part of that, science-based, very serious decarbonization initiatives have proven to improve reputation and brand strength, as well as corporate innovation. So this means that meeting customers' needs, coming up with competitive products, and even entering new markets as part of this innovative process can really translate into increased sales. But beyond having, of course, a strong business case, the net zero target that we're going to see today is also part of a larger mandate. There is this legally binding international treaty on climate change, which is known as the Paris Agreement, which was adopted by 196 parties at the UN Climate Change Conference, COP21 in Paris in 2015. Its goal is to, generally speaking, limit the temperature increase to 1.5% above pre-industrial levels. This means that emissions should ideally peak before 2025 and at least decline by 43% by 2030. Each party to the Paris Agreement, including, of course, the UAE, is required to establish an NDC, which is a nationally determined contribution document, and updated every 5 years. The UAE has published its NDC document and has updated it last in July 2023, so just less than a year ago, as part of its commitment to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. The latest update by the UAE commits to a comprehensive roadmap to achieving 40% emission reduction by 2030 compared to business as usual. And in absolute emission terms, the UAE is eyeing a 19% reduction compared to a baseline set in 2019. Now, before delving into net zero and decarbonization strategies, let's just pick it up where we left it last time, which is, of course, carbon accounting, which is the very first step that organizations must take before looking into reducing emissions. So we've seen that while we very often talk for simplicity about carbon emissions, actually, there are a number of different gases with diverse warming potential that organizations must consider when assessing their footprint. So we have carbon dioxide, of course, but also methane, nitrous oxide, and fluorinated gases. Now, as per the greenhouse gas protocol, these gases shall be categorized under different categories or scopes of emissions. So we have scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3. Depending where they happen, basically across the value chain, and also the type of control that an organization has over them, which can be either direct or indirect. Now, in carrying out this assessment and the calculations of the corporate carbon footprint, it is crucial to not only identify the right scopes and categories of emissions as per the table that you see on the right, and define the operational boundaries, choosing the right accounting and reporting scopes for direct and indirect emissions, but also, as you will see on the left-hand side, basically clearly determine the organizational boundary, which determines which operations are to be included in the assessment and how emissions from each operation are to be consolidated by the reporting company. So the identification of emission sources, the right emission factors, then data collection follows, and emission calculations will, of course, come into the picture in order to establish the baseline of emissions. Once this is done and the corporate carbon footprint is calculated for the identified year, then the decarbonization process can finally take place. And here I will pause and I will leave the floor to Shiv and Vivek for the next slides.
We have just launched a poll on this webinar. See if you can access it. So have you set your GHG baseline is the question we want to answer for today. So for all the attendees in the webinar, please, we'll take a 1 to 2 minute pause, go ahead. And Vivek, as we can see in the current polls, 61% of people have voted no to whether they have set their GHG baseline. So when we start with the net zero basic thing, why do you think it is of a very good need to, kind of start with setting a GHG baseline assessment, and how does it all relate to the entire spectrum of, achieving that roadmap to net zero? Over to you.
Sure, Shiv. Thank you very much. And thanks, Jessica, for leading the session to start with. And apologies, everyone. I've got a bad throat today. We'll try to do my justice. Let me know if anything which I speak is not clear. I will try to repeat that out. Yeah, I mean, I guess, Shiv, this is very, very pertinent. And as your recent survey just showcased, this is precisely the case what's out there in the larger business segment as well. Setting up a GHG baseline it's definitely the start of the whole process, which the business wants to lead into direction of setting up a net zero strategy. This precisely sets your the current status in terms of where the emission is coming from, and this becomes sort of a backbone of how you can really think about achieving net zero. Until you know where your current standing is, you won't be able to take a path towards net zero, and that's where baseline becomes very important. However, in the real world scenario, if we see, most of the businesses today find it really difficult to pass through the maze of establishing their carbon footprint, very scientifically accurately mapping their carbon emissions, where exactly it is coming from, what is the real source of that emission, how can they really look into their emissions, which is coming from the complete supply chain, from upstream of their business or downstream of their business. And that's where this whole exercise becomes a little bit complicated. This is precisely where setting up a very scientifically thorough baseline sets a very foundation of how accurately or how closely you will be able to match your targets with respect to decarbonization. And that's where it becomes really very critical first step towards decarbonization. Now, coming back to our conversation for today, which is around the GHG management and looking at decarbonization. Now, this flow chart pretty simply lays out the whole pathways, starting from the very first line. You would see that on the left side, it starts with baseline assessment, which I just talked about. This is the foundation of how a business can really think about setting their net zero or decarbonization pathways. Once you know exactly where you stand in today, the next step comes in how it's going to look like if I do nothing, how these emissions would look like in future, which is talking about emission projections. Once your emission projections are ready, now you know that if you and your business doesn't take any step towards decarbonization, how the overall emission with the growth of business is going to look like in the future. That's where the first step as a business is to set a vision around decarbonization. Now, when we say that decarbonization target, this is precisely a numerical form of what the vision says. If the vision says that I want to become net zero by 2030, 2040, or 2050, now that basically becomes a target, right? Now, a target for the business to cut their current level of emission and future emissions to a level where by that year you achieve your decarbonization level that you are targeting for. So that's precisely, it's about the decarbonization target. Identifying decarbonization lever is the very next step. Now you have set up yourself to a target. How to achieve that target, what is the mean to achieve that target is the decarbonization lever. Decarbonization lever, again, depends on what sort of decarbonization trajectory you wanted to achieve. So we will see more about decarbonization lever in the slides further. But broadly speaking, these are all the mechanisms by which you are going to achieve your target of decarbonization. Once you identify all the decarbonization levers, again, with every lever, there could be a possibility of certain cost reduction because of efficiency measures. There could be incremental cost, capex involvement, or probably an opex involvement for a long period of time because of that decarbonization initiative being implemented. So there are certain cost elements. There are other decision factors which are involved with every decarbonization lever. So what it needs now for business to really evaluate and create a couple of scenarios around all the decarbonization lever. Scenario planning is more about mixing and matching multiple decarbonization Now, with every scenario, there'll be a different trajectory of decarbonization. So in very standard business parlance, as we typically put a low case, a medium case, or a high case, or otherwise we say optimistic scenario, realistic scenario, pessimistic scenario. So these are again scenarios of decarbonization. Now, same set of levers deployed in different timelines to different extent create a particular scenario around decarbonization. And every scenario, then you try to map it with respect to what is the budget associated with it. As you can see, the next point after the scenario planning is about budget of decarbonization. Now, organization based on their set targets can be very aggressive around their overall budgeting that they want to do for decarbonization, as we understand that every initiative that you're taking up is going to involve some element of cost with it or cost saving associated with it. So you need to really look into the budget aspect just to see that to achieve my target, what is the best value for money that I can put on the table, right? If I invest in $100, how can I maximize the amount of CO2 saving with that same $100? So that's precisely what you're doing is, after a scenario planning, you're trying to marry that with the budget element. And that's where you come up with your final scenario or an implementation case scenario where you know that I'm going to deploy A, B, C levers into these sort of business streams of that is giving me carbon emissions, and would look into the implementation aspect. And that's where the monitoring monitoring your progress towards the decarbonization starts. So once you implement your decarbonization lever, for the period of time you are implementing all of them, and eventually the results of that is what you start mapping and measuring that how much carbon reduction is actually you are achieving out of those levers. Based on that, definitely there needs to be some sort of course correction, because there are things in planning, and while things in implementation, there could be a little difference in that. And that's what you need to always go back into your overall decarbonization pathway and see that how these levers are actually reflecting in terms of actual decarbonization achieved. And that's where you need to tweak your plans, you need to adjust your targets, you need to adjust your levers, the implementation of that, and come up to see that you again come back to the trajectory of decarbonization that you have set yourself for. After the implementation and ongoing monitoring is where you come to know exactly what is the level of carbon emission that remains completely unabated. And that unabated emission is what you look out to create some sort of an offset residual emissions plan. So this gives us two sets of things. One, in terms of all your decarbonization initiatives and associated decarbonization happening, and also the residual emission, which cannot be addressed with all these decarbonization levers. That gives us an offset plan for the coming future. With all of this together is where you are inching towards your set target of net zero. So this is just broadly speaking the whole flow of starting from baseline to achieving the net zero is. Now coming to the emission projection, as we typically do in our businesses, we do a lot of cash flow projections, we do activity projections, we do production projections. Similarly, in case of emission projections, what it needs is, the very first step is, of course, the baseline emission, where I'm standing in today in terms of my current GHG emissions. The next thing is about what is the growth factor, the compounded annual growth rate, or an year-on-year growth rate of emissions that's going to happen. Now, for that, unfortunately, we don't have any direct measure as such. I mean, not all the businesses would have it. Few businesses definitely would have it, where they know very clearly that X amount of emission is coming from Y amount of production. So they have a proxy of emission, how it's going to look like, or get the projection. So you need to really find the right proxy of how your emission is going to grow, with what activity of my business, which is going to have the maximum impact in my emissions. So once you identify those, the growth drivers, the business growth drivers, you need to really deploy that on top of your business emission, the baseline emissions, to achieve your projected emissions. So the equation is pretty straightforward. You have a baseline emission, you have growth factors which are coming from the business, which results in giving you a projected emission. Now, these growth factors again can vary, right? It can vary between business to business. For a real estate company, it could be very clearly the amount of real estate area development that they are planning for the next 4, 5, 10 years. For a facility management company, it could be all about the area under management, right? The area that they're going to supervise or keep maintaining about that. So that would be a very clear business emission growth factor that can be taken. For companies which are, let's say, into aluminum production, very simply for them, it would be all around the amount of aluminum production that they want to do, or probably the various different processes which are involved in the aluminum production, how exactly their energy consumption is going to grow over the years. All of that would reflect onto how their emission is going to grow. So that's where the whole emission projection gets done. So you start from your base year and you project your emission until the year you wanted to achieve your net zero targets. So typically this starts from current year until 2050. That's how you do the emission projections for. So moving on from there, as we have seen earlier in the flow chart, starts from the baseline, you do the baseline projections. Now you're ready with your emission projections. So it gives you a very clear picture. And typically we had seen that the emissions when projected in business as usual scenario where you are not deploying any decarbonization initiative, you're not working on reducing your carbon emissions of the product, all of that, typically these business as usual emissions can go probably as low as probably 2.5 to 3 times to more than 7 to 8 times in the future. This is the impact. And that's where you come to know that cumulatively, if I add up year-on-year emission from, let's say, 2024 until 2025, these 27 years, the whole emission that cumulatively from your business, unabated format, you're going to basically release in the environment, that gives the whole size of the problem, right? So that's where precisely we need to really identify that what sort of target, the emission reduction target that I need to put in place. So if I put it, the target setting bit, this is pretty straightforward. This is broken into 3 broad elements. When you set up a target, first of all, you want to set up that what timelines that I'm going to put my target for, whether it's a short-term timeline or a long-term timeline. So very clearly, the general industry acceptance is that short-term is anywhere between 1 to 5 year to 7 years time frame is what you set your short-term targets for. Typically, from Paris Climate Agreement perspective, the short-term target year is typically 2030. So that's the global stock take year when the world wants to really review that, where exactly globally our emissions had gone, where the target had been kept to cut the emission by 50%. That's the first year, which is typically taken as in the short-term period. But there is no hard and fast rule around that. There are organizations who are setting their targets as close as 2026, 2025 sometimes, or can go beyond 2030, and they can also set targets, short-term targets for 2032, 33, 34, like that. This all depends on what sort of industry and sector you are in, right? The sectors which are identified as hard to abate sectors, for them, short-term target in absence of any technology earlier than 2030 would not make sense, because if most of the decarbonization technology is going to be commercially available by 2030, you setting a short-term target is shooting in your foot actually. So from that perspective, the target time frame is very critical for you to really understand the maturity of decarbonization levers which are available within your industry for deployment. If that is known very well, you can set up your targets as per your wish before 2030 or after 2030. Long-term targets typically are always linked with your eventual net zero goal. So let's say I'm a utility company, I'm a electricity producing production company like as DIVA or SEVA or something like that, right? For them, typically the global industry benchmark today is set the long-term net zero target around by 2040. So that's the sector which has been identified to be most aggressive when it comes to decarbonization. And that's where their long-term targets are typically 2040. So if I'm into a power production or sort of a power generation company, I would like to align my long-term target aligned with 2040 targets. But otherwise, for rest of the sectors, they can always pick up any year starting 2035 onwards until 2050 or even beyond, right? Countries we have seen, they have set their net zero target beyond 2050, 2060, 2070. So similarly, industries also can pick up accordingly depending on which geographical location they are operating from primarily. So this is basically the target time frame. The second thing comes, which is the most important, which is about target method. Now, there is no sort of a single streamline, unique one method of setting your targets. Targets can be set based on what is the standard benchmark that runs in that industry. So there are 4 identifiable target methods which typically are deployed. One is definitely the intensity-based targets. Intensity-based targets could be economic intensity, physical intensity. So this I'm talking about, let's say I'm a steel producer and I produce a steel which is, say, emits 15 ton per ton of steel produced. So this is my physical intensity. Every ton of steel is going to give me 15 tons of greenhouse gas emission. So this is my physical intensity. It could be economic intensity, which is basically if I'm into, let's say, some industry, which is, let's say an IT industry, right? When I provide a lot of IT and software development services. For me, the biggest source, or rather the correct benchmark probably would be economic intensity. For every $1 million of revenue that I generate, I am emitting 2.5 tons of CO2. So this is my economic intensity, 2.5 tons of CO2 per dollar, per dollar million or per dollar revenue. So these are intensity-based targets. Absolute targets, as the name suggests, is very clear that you are putting absolutely a reduction. Let's say I'm weighing 80 kg, I want to cut down my weight by 70 kg. That's my absolute target. Similarly, for in business, it could be I'm emitting, let's say today, my total emission is 5.5 million tons or 6 million tons, and I want to cut it by 50% by 2030 to 3 million tons. That's my absolute reduction target. Then comes the renewable-based target, which is again, since scope 2 is pretty much about your electricity requirement. Also in scope 1, a lot of thermal energy requirement, if that can also be fed with renewables. So that's where the third level of target could be, which is I source my energy requirement from renewable, and there is a percentage of that. So let's say 2030, I want to source my overall power requirement, 50% of it by renewable. So that's like a target, which is around you buying RE power. The last element on the target method is, which is primarily for your scope 3 based emission, which is called supply chain engagement. Now, supply chain engagement, it is a little tricky to understand, but look at it from this perspective. When I have my total emission of 100 tons, of which 80 tons comes from, let's say, my scope 3. Within my scope 3, I would know that there are almost more than half of the categories in scope 3, those are coming from my purchases. So basically my emission is getting driven by how my suppliers' sustainability standards are. So I come to know that out of 80 ton, 40 ton is coming from 2 of the suppliers, right? Now, if I set my net zero target, I definitely need to look into my scope 3 targets as well. Now my scope 3 targets, if this is the case where out of 100 ton, 80 ton is coming from scope 3 and half of that is coming from a couple of suppliers itself, until my suppliers decarbonize, I won't be able to tackle that 40 ton of emission, which is coming from my suppliers. That's where you can set up supply chain engagement related targets, which is, I would put it that 50% of my suppliers or 30% of my suppliers by 2030, I would engage them on decarbonization and have them, they set their net zero targets in line with my net zero targets. That could be, that on the face of it, again, looks like a very qualitative target. But if you really drill down, it involves a good amount of engagement in terms of the data that you directly need from your suppliers, and then eventually help them take their climate pledges and climate actions and set their net zero targets. So this is what called supply engagement. For organizations who have got a huge sort of a supply chain existing, for them, this becomes one of the biggest levers sometimes to set a target which is achievable. Until they have the engagement in place, they won't be able to achieve their net zero targets. So moving on from there to approach of target setting. So now you have got a time frame, you have got some target set for your scope 1, 2, 3. It is about the approach of target setting. Now, target setting approach is more about that, how you're going to get aligned with your target, right? When I set my target, I might set my target completely based on my own requirements. When I don't follow any industry benchmarks, standards, I just simply believe that, yeah, I mean, I am emitting certain amount of emission. By 2030, I want to cut it to 30%. And by 2050, I want to cut it to net zero. So this is sort of a custom target. I'm not aligning with anyone. I set my own board's vision, and accordingly, I set my targets. SBTi, as most of you might have heard about, it's Science-Based Target Initiative. Again, this is like a multi-industry body where they are coming up with a lot of approaches, very specific for specific sectors, and identifying that what sort of target the industry needs to set so as to align with the global decline on decarbonization that the world wants to achieve today. So that's where SBTi target setting process comes in handy. NDC, as Jessica earlier picked up, the NDC targets are more of your national targets. If the government here, if we talk about it, UAE government has set a target of cutting their emission by 19% by 2019 baseline, and that has a very specific target that the construction industry has to cut their emission by 56% by 2030. Now, this is an NDC target. Now, tomorrow, if I am a development company or a construction company and I want to set my targets, I might align myself with the NDCs altogether. And that's where I set my targets along with NDC. The industry guidance is more about if your industry has very specific guidance given by some global bodies, like as there could be an Aluminium Association, Steel and Iron Industry Association, Aviation has got set of industry associations. Similarly, all these large sectors have got their sector-specific guidance. So you can even follow your industry benchmarks that what sort of decarbonization target one should set. So that's all about in broad about target setting. Moving on to SBTi very quickly. Now this slide, I hope you guys can see it very well. SBTi, it basically gives you guidance around that how should you be setting your short-term, long-term net zero targets. And as you can see on the right table, it is shown very clearly there are a couple of approaches. You can take an absolute contraction, as we earlier said, or could take a sectoral decarbonization approach. Now, depending on if, let's say, you're coming from an aluminum industry, aluminum industry has gotten specific target guidelines given by SBTi. So you can choose your short-term, long-term, you set your base year, you identify what is your current emission, and then you identify that how your emission should be projected. So you can either align with your current share of production vis-a-vis the global aluminum production, and based on that growth rate, you can set your future production. Or you can define your own growth rate, right? Today, I might be producing 1,000 tons of aluminum. I'm thinking by 2030, we would be reaching to, let's say, 5,000 tons. So that way, you can provide your projections of production. And accordingly, the overall emission intensity would be worked out. And you can set your target as seen in the graph on the bottom below, which shows that based on this set criterias, SBTi would give you direction in terms of what is the percentage reduction year on year you should be able to achieve. So that's the target of achieving the net zero as per SBTi. SBTi, when the company really intends to set up their targets, they always come up with very specifically put up an application, you get this approved, and finally SBTi declares your name that you have set up your target as per SBTi. So that's about SBTi very quickly on it. Sorry. Now, identifying decarbonization levers. So we have seen the baseline, we have got the projections done, we have got the target set, and now is the point where we need to identify what are the decarbonization lever. Again, picking up an example from, let's say, aluminum industry. And as we all understand that aluminum industry has got major emission coming from of course, the bauxite mining, which is the raw material, but beyond that, the whole refining process, which is about digestion of bauxite, the calcination, the overall aluminum smelting, and finally the primary casting. Now, with all of these respective stages of aluminum production have got a varied amount of energy requirements and hence some amount of GHG emission. So if we look at the scope 1 emission, which is majorly one of the biggest contributor in the aluminum industry's greenhouse gas emission, the digestion element, currently, it's been run with thermal boilers where you burn coal or probably some other oils by which you generate steam and you basically do the digestion portion of it. There, the very clear sort of a decarbonization approaches that you can switch to electric boilers. These are only, for example, here, there are multiple such levers within aluminum industry. We have picked a few. Similarly, for the calcination process, you can think of green hydrogen being fed. to run the boilers again, and you can do the calcination there. The scope 2 is very clearly you can move to low emission grid, of course, based on the RE fed grid, and that can cut a huge amount of your scope 2 emissions, or SMRs, which are again nuclear small medium scale reactors. So this is again a technology which is not yet completely commercialized, but beyond 2040 that would also be available. Scope 3 is all about your identifying the right sort of a logistical opportunities by which you can reduce your basically transportation related emission, identifying the right green routes by which you can ship your aluminium to the right markets. And of course, using scrap, which is one of the biggest decarbonization lever. If you start using aluminium scrap itself, basically the recycled aluminium, go into in place of bauxite, that effectively cuts 97% of your overall emission. So these are a few of the levers that you identify. Similarly, depending on the industry, you would have multiple levers available in front of you. You can pick and choose from them. That would define your overall decarbonization pathway. Now, this is about decarbonization budget. As we were seeing earlier, while you pick and choose decarb levers, set up certain scenarios, you want to marry each scenario with certain amount of carbon budgets with it. So this is where the marginal abatement cost curve comes in handy. So if you can look at on the left side, all these colored multiple bars of different widths and height represent something. On the y-axis, we have the marginal abatement cost, which is to abate 1 ton of CO2, what is the amount of investment that it needs? Amount of investment or amount of savings that it could generate. The width of the graph tells that what is the extent of carbon emission that could be reduced, whether 1 ton, 2 ton, 10 million tons. So depending on what is the total amount of, in quantum, the carbon emission reduction that would happen, that would define the width. The length would define that, whether at what cost that amount of reduction would happen. So whether if it is on the positive side of y-axis, this is all carbon abatement measures which would come at an incremental investment. However, every graph which is below the y-axis, so below the x-axis, which is on the negative y-axis, is every initiative which would cut the carbon emission, but it would also save you. So pretty much all your energy saving measures, energy efficiency measures, those always invariably fall on the negative side, meaning to say you implement those initiatives, it would give you some savings, but at the same time would also save you carbon emission. Every behavioral based decarbonization initiative would always come at no cost or sort of cost saving, and also would give you incremental amount of carbon emission reduction. However, every element which is on the positive side of y-axis, these are initiatives which are implemented by probably retrofitting your plants or probably looking at changing your whole energy usage pattern as such. So shifting your boilers, your furnaces, looking at switching at fuel, probably a little costly fuel in case of fuel. You look at all those initiatives, they will come, they will provide you decarbonization, but you need to invest more in it. So that gives you, one organization can get to see their complete marginal abatement cost curve and can very clearly identify that what all initiatives would give me the maximum amount of reduction at least cost. So that's called the marginal cost. And this also defines very clearly that you can draw the line of carbon offsets, which is a horizontal dotted line you can see. And you can see that, like, if carbon offsets are available, then at what cost you would be able to do it with carbon offset, but not implementing those levers. So that's sort of a decision point that can be achieved from the MAC curve itself. Moving on from here very quickly to Q&A. And thanks a lot, Shiv. The Q&A came in because my voice was really cracking now. Sorry for that.
I can totally feel you, Vivek. So, guys, this is supposed to be a quick Q&A section. So if we have any kind of queries, feel free to put them here. If there's anything you have missed or have queries about for the things that we have covered up till now. And while people are doing that, Vivek, we do have a question from Vakar. So how are the emission projections determined using the first year GHG inventory? And is there any standard methodology to follow?
Right. Thanks, Vikas, for the question. For the emission projection, as I was mentioning earlier, you have to really identify the business matrix. So business matrix are basically identified from the business in terms of the activities from the business which are contributing maximum amount of emissions. So, and as I gave earlier an example, let's say if you are in steel production and you know that all your carbon emission majorly is coming from the raw material sourcing, then depending on what sorts of sourcing that you're going to do in the future, say from 100 ton to 200 ton of raw material being purchased, this is effectively 2x of overall growth in your production is. So correspondingly, your emission would also be projected in the same time frame to 2x values. Once you get to that with the business matrix, you identify the future emissions. Beyond that period, the emission is always grown based on the compounded annual growth rates that you would identify between the current year and the projected year that you've used.
Thank you for that insightful answer, Vivek, and we hope that we were able to answer that query. If there are any more questions I would oblige all of you to move to the Q&A section and put down your questions there. And once we complete this webinar, we are going to have one final Q&A session where we are going to go over all of the questions once again.
So now moving on from the fundamentals to the real case study. So we will very quickly go through it. This is one of the study done for a real estate player. Here, we were tasked to create the net zero strategy for them, starting from setting up baseline, identifying emission projections, doing some target setting exercise, and eventually identifying decarb lever scenarios to be able to achieve the emission reduction. Now, the multiple decarbonization levers that we have identified for the company was low carbon design. Of course, eliminating the design sort of overpurchase out there helps you basically reduce your overall consumption of material and eventually helps you cut your carbon emission. Switching to REN, clean energy, of course, is one of the lever. Electrification of sites, so basically looking at sites which are fed with the local grid or probably the local site-based electricity generation from renewable sources was one of the key lever there. Resource and energy efficiency, which is pretty much linked to the low carbon design itself at the design stage. However, over the period of the project, again, there could be resource optimization done, which helps us cut our carbon emissions. Supply chain decarbonization, which was identified as one of the key levers for them, as most of the material that was going for the construction basically comes with a heavy carbon footprint. That's where we started optimizing in terms of what sort of carbon reduction is possible from supply chain decarbonization. Construction material, again, as we all understand, all the concrete, the cement, the clinker, all of that goes into the product, into the building construction as such, contributes a maximum amount of carbon emission. And that's where, again, we looked at items which could be probably having a recycling characteristics or probably looking at some low carbon supplies as such, which could help them cut the carbon emission. Waste reduction and segregation, again, one of the key levers. It contributes a good amount of carbon emission. We looked at identifying all the construction waste, whatever can be recovered from it, what sort of recovery and recycling that can happen with the waste, which can help cut the carbon emissions again. Carbon offsetting, of course, is the last resort, wherever the unabated emissions were. We were looking at and suggesting the carbon offsetting option there to help them achieve net zero. If we very quickly look into a couple of next graphs, which basically talks about, this is the stationary combustion, which was coming from all the DG set, burning a lot of diesel out there. Here, we were talking about multiple blending scenarios with the biofuel, the waste oil, basically the waste oil recovery based biofuels, which are blended to 5, 10, 15% of blending with the current diesel consumption and helps them achieve sort of decarbonization, which can be seen in the green graph here. Moving on from here to again, from the mobile combustion, there was a possibility of all the vehicles which are running have a blending of biofuel happening again, the biodiesel and ethanol-based petrol there, and conversion from IC to EVs, which are in a standard decarbonization level. Again, a huge level of drop in carbon emission could be achieved there. Construction material, sorry, slide back. Yeah, this is again a very standard one where we're talking about purchase electricity, moving to solar-based electricity generation could help achieve directly the 2050 target. Here, what we additionally did is we evaluated the UAE's grid intensity reduction over the period. We have deployed both of it, and wherever there was a shortfall in the in basically the decarbonization pathway, we added site-based solar electricity generation to basically align the curve, the decarbonization curve as such. The recycling and the low carbon material, as I earlier mentioned, that looking at probably updating the clinker to cement ratios, identifying the greener options of purchases, the steel, the aluminium which goes into the construction, the fabrication materials, that all together also help them cut and bring down their overall carbon emissions on their net zero journey as such. Now, very quickly, I wanted to sum up here with respect to what we've learned, basically from starting with the baseline projections and going until the stage where we identify decarbonization levers and eventually deploy those levers to achieve the decarbonization target. That all can be done from our platform Zero. And if we can very quickly look into this, basically the tool.
If you want, I can take it up from here, as I feel that your throat is...
Yeah, actually. So if you can, please. Thank you so much. Thanks, Jessica.
Really, not a problem. Thank you so much for the overview. And of course, as Shiv mentioned, if there are any questions on, the earlier slides, please feel free to ask them, and we will make sure to answer them all. Very quickly, of course, we know that in whatever journey we've seen now through the presentation shared by Vivek, of course, there are a lot of different aspects that organizations must really focus on in their decarbonization journey. So emission projections, identifying the right decarbonization levers after having set their net zero targets. So very briefly, we have sort of addressed all these challenges in the decarbonization process, developing an AI-driven solution. It's a SaaS platform called Zero, which all in all offers a comprehensive solution to measure the carbon footprint, set the net zero targets as we've seen, develop that decarbonization roadmap, including also, the marginal abatement cost, understanding, help offset whatever residual emissions are there, monitor a variety of ESG topics, and then report action. So the tool enables organizations to automatically basically set their net zero targets, which can be either SBTi compliant or custom decarbonization goals, short, long term, looking at the various, ways in which targets can be set that Vivek already mentioned. So absolute intensity, or even, supply chain engagement or renewables when it comes to scope 2 emissions. The tool enables organizations, again, to automatically identify and implement also decarbonization levers, see, what impact select decarbonization levers can have on the net zero journey of any organization, and provide real-time sort of data and analysis and understanding of the performance against the target sets. As we've seen, of course, supply chain decarbonization is crucial in order to achieve whatever decarbonization targets organizations have set for themselves. So there is a module developed to help organizations sort of streamline this entire process of engaging with suppliers, analyzing and rating suppliers based on their sustainability sort of performance, identifying top emitting suppliers, and really onboard suppliers on the net zero journey of the organization. This was very quickly about Zero, our platform, but happy to, of course, engage with you if you would like to know more about Zero and its capabilities. Over to Shiv for the Q&A session, and thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Jessica and Vivek, for that. So we are now moving towards the end of the webinar, and if any of us have any questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A section and we will get back to it one by one. We do have a first question here for the panel. What is the timeline required to calculate baseline for a real estate company?
Shiv, if I can take that up. Sure. So basically this again, it's little subjective here. If I put it two ways to do it. One, of course, is in the consultative way where you engage a consultant and help you get your baseline assessment done. Typically, it could be an exercise of a couple of months, or probably like 6 to 8 weeks, if I put it that way. It all depends on the current status of the data, right? As we can all understand that setting up baseline involves a huge amount of data sets that need to be taken up from the business to be able to really identify the whole baseline exercise. If the data is made available, I guess the only exercise is all about doing the whole calculation bit of it, and could be really shortened from my earlier stated timeline. On the other hand, if a platform like the one that Jessica just showed is deployed on the use because it had got automated data ingestion capabilities, the whole exercise can be done in a couple of weeks itself. Soon the company gets set up on the platform and APIs come into play in the data ingestion. The baseline exercise could be a matter of couple of weeks itself. So that's how, if I would sum it up.
Thank you for that insight, Vivek. We are not having any more questions at the moment, and it seems like we are also running a bit on top of the time. So I would want to end this webinar with a thank you note for everyone. I would also want to put out this. If you have any more questions and answers specific to this webinar, or if you're looking forward to understand how your company can reach net zero, feel free to reach out to us on that email ID, and we'll be like more than happy to take it ahead from there. And just another final note on our upcoming webinars. So the next one that we are going to have is in April, 30th April to be exact, and where we are going to tackle scope 3 emissions. And following that, in May, we are going to deep dive into finance emissions, which, seeing the post COP28 times that we live in, seems like the right direction to put the energies in. With that, I would want to thank all of you once again for joining us today. And we do look forward to seeing you at our next webinar.
Thanks, Shiv, and thanks all the attendees. Thank you very much for joining and giving your valuable time this morning. We love to have these sessions going on, and we will add more and more topics. You can always reach out to us in terms of any specific segment of the whole GHG maze that you wanted to understand. We will do our best. We'll come up with the content which can be of great use for you where you are working. Of course, we are always available to help you beyond that. But yes, from the webinar perspective, any specific topic that you want to learn more about, we would love to take that up in our future sessions.